All right. Well, hello and welcome everyone to this tribute to the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg under the auspices of the Mirowitz Center. Please check out the center's website, e-blast, and Facebook page for information about upcoming programs. My name is Susan Whitty. I'm chair of the Mirowitz Center Advisory Council, and it is my honor to welcome all of you and introduce our presenter and my friend, Judge Susan Block. Judge Block returned to the practice of law after retiring as a circuit judge in 2004 with 25 years of judicial service. The recipient of the Andrew Jackson Higgins Award for Excellence in Juvenile Justice, her work in the area of family law and child advocacy is recognized locally and internationally. Judge Block served on the first board of directors for the National Truancy Prevention Association and Lawyers for Equality. She was appointed by the Missouri Supreme Court to its Committee on Racial and Ethnic Fairness, Juvenile Subcommittee, with a special focus on referrals to the court and alternative to detention and commitments to the Department of Youth Services. Former Missouri Governor Jay Nixon also appointed her to serve on the board of the Missouri Children's Trust Fund, which seeks to prevent child abuse and educate the community on this important issue. The list of Judge Block's publications is far too long to repeat, as is the list of her many local awards, which she has received, including from the St. Louis Bar Association and the Missouri Supreme Court. But as a past president of National Council of Jewish Women, St. Louis, I would be remiss not to mention that Judge Block was also the recipient of the NCJW Hannah G. Solomon Founders Award, our very highest honor. As someone with such a distinguished record on the bench, there are truly not too many people as qualified as Judge Block to lead this tribute to the late RBG. Thank you, Susan, for being with us today.
Thank you, Susan. Now everybody knows why I love the Mirowitz Center and why I love NCJW, and particularly you, Susan, who I've watched grow into this tremendous leader. Thank you for all you've done. Well, thanks to everybody who came out this morning. Nobody had trouble finding a parking space? No, I don't think so. We're going to not make this like a law school class. I'm not going to call on anybody. And I could see a couple lawyers are very grateful for that. But I was just so really not just honored, but delighted when Stephen suggested that I lead this really sort of Shiva memorial to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of my heroes. And we've entitled it Remembering Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Judith Oliver, who is a wonderful techie on this, is going to assist with the PowerPoint.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I've got it. All right. So I call this Remembering Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg because I believe that she is our beacon of light. And we always say, may her memory be a blessing. And sometimes I say this at the end of what I'm going to say when I'm talking about her or somebody else like her. But I think we all know in Jewish tradition, saying may her memory be a blessing is really not looking backwards. It's really looking forward. And it's really a call to us to carry on her work, because that would really make her memory a blessing. Let's take a look at her personal life. I will alternatively call her RBG. I don't think I'll ever call her Ruth, or I'll call her Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. By the way, a little bit of RBG trivia. Her real name is not, her legal born name was not Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was Joan Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But when she went to school, her mother, a Jewish mother, talked to the teacher and said, there are a lot of Joans in this class. Could we call my Joan Ruth? And that stuck. And I love the word Ruth. I love that as a name. It's a biblical word. It's a really strong word. And I think that's just a really wonderful piece of trivia that I picked up in my research. So you see, when she was born in Brooklyn, New York, and when, you know, really when she died recently that we're all very sad about. She had a long and very happy marriage to Martin Ginsburg. Unfortunately, he predeceased her, and they have 2 children, Jane and James. She doesn't really talk too much about her children or her grandchildren, and people have commented that she was really being protective of them. And I think with all the notoriety that she had, and we're just so fortunate something terrible didn't happen to her, because she really spoke out on sensitive kinds of issues. But she was very proud of them, and I know she had at least one grandchild named Spira, who was really the one who reported that her parting wish was that her nomination would not be filled until after the election. And we don't know how that's going to happen, but we're still hoping. We take a look at her education and career next. So she went to Cornell University, and she got a BA. The most interesting part, I think, to her was that's where she met Marty. Marty was the guy who she has been said to tell loved her for her brain. But I'll tell you, if you look at her pictures, she was a beautiful woman. So I think maybe there was a little more to it than that, but I think she liked to say that. And she started at Harvard Law School, but Marty at that point had already graduated. They were married a year after she graduated from college, so she wanted to join him at Columbia. Harvard would not let her graduate from Harvard because her last year was going to be at Columbia. I think today they would. Things were a little different back then. And I don't know if any of you know Shulama Simon, a good friend of mine, who's watching. She's also a graduate of Columbia University School of Law. So we know a couple of people that graduated from that great law school. I had some experiences like this when I was in law school, but she was asked by the dean at Harvard Law School, "Why are you taking the place of a man?" Now that does not happen anymore, because about half or more of the law students are women. As the saying goes, we've come a long way, baby. She was a law clerk for the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York. Now, why that position? She really wanted to be a law clerk for Felix Frankfurter. Well, sadly enough, he wasn't ready for a woman law clerk. Now, we're not talking about like 100 years ago. We're talking about like the mid-50s. So she was deprived of being a law clerk at the Supreme Court, but she took care of that later. She was also after that, she wanted to go to work for some big law firms. She could not get those jobs, those jobs that the top male students were getting at big law firms. So she actually suffered sex discrimination way back then. So, sometimes impediments turn out to be good fortune to us. And it was good fortune because she became a professor at Rutgers Law School and Columbia Law School. And then the most important job she had was the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And let's see, I want to figure out how to get this over. Excuse me for a minute. Then she had a saying, and her quotes are beautiful. There are several books out there that you can get. Women's rights are an essential part of the overall human rights agenda, trained on the equal dignity and ability to live in freedom all people should enjoy. So instead of it being women's rights and people saying untoward things like bra burners or things like that, she elevated it and defined it at human rights. Let's take a look now at some other early words of wisdom. I thought this was really interesting. So in preparation for this women's law project, She said, I read every federal case that had to do with women's equality or the lack thereof, and every law review article available. And when I came to the end of that sentence, I thought, wow, that's a lot. Not true. Now that was quite an undertaking, but in fact, it was easily manageable because there was so little. And she took care of that too, because she created a lot of federal case law and law review articles that had to do with women's equality. Next, we're going to take a look at cases that she argued as a lawyer before the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, as all lawyers will tell you, this is one of the greatest achievements for many, many lawyers. There are very few, when you consider the whole mass of lawyers in the United States, who have actually argued cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, some outstanding lawyers have not, but she did. And her arguing before the Supreme Court of the United States, she really saw that as an extension of her advocacy for gender equality. She really saw it as educating male judges. And remember, during this time, there were only men on the Supreme Court. Some of you may not remember that time, but there they were, 9 men in black dresses on the Supreme Court. So what was one of the first cases she argued? Well, I think that her approach was to really talk about not women's rights so much, but to talk about gender equality. Because if she were arguing that a male was being denied gender equality, she felt like that could be a prelude to greater understanding about what happens when women were denied gender equality. And this first case, Frontario, was about a woman, Sharon Frontario. These cases are actually about people, for those of you who don't, aren't lawyers. They're real people whose cases are being argued in front of the Supreme Court. She was an Air Force lieutenant. Her husband wasn't eligible for spousal benefits from her work in the uniformed services because he failed to prove that he was economically dependent on his wife. Now flip that. This condition was not required for wives of males to qualify for the same benefits. So that's really what Justice Ginsburg was talking about when she talked about gender equality. Are people of different genders treated equally under the laws of our country? And if they're not, she made it her mission to do as much as she could to be sure that they were. And she focused on differential treatment based on gender as being harmful to all involved. So it would be harmful not only to the lieutenant, but it would be harmful to her husband. And she really had a reverence that we'll talk a little bit later about marriage, that I think that this carried over in this particular decision. Okay, let's take a look at more cases. So I just found this was really kind of interesting that you would actually take this kind of a case to the Supreme Court. But it was another strategic point of how Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg at that time, not a judge yet, was thinking about how can I educate the court about these differences and these disparities in gender equality. By the way, she didn't really like the word sex discrimination. she liked to talk at gender. And she said something I thought was kind of funny. She said she thought the word sex was a little distracting to this very important legal argument. So the Supreme Court, in this case, struck down an Oklahoma statute that said women as young as 18 could buy 3.2 beer, but men had to be 21. And you wouldn't think a case like this would go to the Supreme Court. But you know what I like about it is really has a simple principle that there is not gender equality in being able to do something to buy beer. And the underlying points are, does the government have some kind of a compelling reason to distinguish between what women can do, what women can buy, and what men can buy? So that's why I added that case. The next case is also, I think, interesting, but we got to go back again, Judith. I'm not that way. Okay, thanks. Reed versus Reed. Here, the court struck down an Idaho statute. So that's really what the Supreme Court is doing, by the way. I mean, they're looking at state laws and see if they meet the test of constitutionality. Do they uphold the Constitution? Because as you know from other cases, our states, even with the pandemic, are all running amok. States' rights, this state has masks, this state doesn't. And this is true with a lot of different kind of statutes. So it really is challenging for people who are dealing in gender equality to make a strong statement about one state statute that they may find to be violative of the Constitution, so that other states don't pass statutes like that. We would hope, but that isn't always true. Here, the court struck down an Idaho statute that automatically gave preference to men for appointment as administrator of a deceased person's estate. So that could mean that you're the daughter of your mom and she passes, you have taken care of all of her bills, all of her medical treatment. You actually have a CPA degree. And at this time, a man, maybe your brother, who was a dentist, who has his own accountant, who never had hands-on care of your mother, and he gets preference. Well, that's just wrong. That's what we talk about in gender equality. So the other importance of this case was it extended the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause as a guarantee to women for the first time. And to me, that seems amazing that it hadn't happened before. And finally, on this page, it's a reminder that cases established a standard requiring the government to show that any sex classification, and they did use the word sex there, had to have a substantial relationship to an important state interest. And that's a pretty high bar. So that's what these cases did that were so important. I see on the chat someone's asking me how long ago was Reed, and I have it somewhere, but I don't have it here. So we can find that out later. All right, we're going to go on to some more cases. This is one of my favorite cases. This is Weinberger versus, okay, we got an answer to that question. Nancy Price, thank you, said 1971. I don't know about you, but that's not that long ago to me. It's actually a little before I started practicing law, but it wasn't that long ago. What was it? 50 years ago? That's not that long, right? Weinberger versus Weissenfeld. Here, Social Security benefits were denied to widowed fathers that were afforded to widowed mothers. So the law deprived the fathers for caring for their children in the same way it provided for mothers. So what happened in this case was that a woman died and left her husband with a couple of kids. And she wasn't allowed to get Social Security benefit. He wasn't allowed to get Social Security benefits based on her death. He would have been able to if he had been her. So that's gender equality. And that's what they're talking about the deprivation of fathers from caring for their children in the same way provided for mothers, because if he had gotten those benefits, maybe he wouldn't have had to work. Maybe he wouldn't have had to work such long hours. Or maybe it's just the right thing to do. Well, we know one thing, that was unconstitutional. And it was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her years as an attorney, a fiery advocate, that helped us with that. Let's take a look at really what is the broad meaning of gender equality, so that when you leave here, you'll have a couple of big bright spots that you'll be able to share with others. Women will have achieved equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. Well, I can tell you, when I was married and my husband was a very nice guy, that was just nothing that we ever really even thought about. Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on the other hand, I thought I was feisty. She's way more feisty. They called her from her child's school and they said, you know, your daughter, blah, blah, blah. And she said, do you know that her father and I share the responsibility of her upbringing? I got the last call. How about if you make the next call to him? I can't imagine even saying that at that time. Now I would. So that's what we're talking about, or what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was talking about when she was talking about the broadest view of gender equality, is really bringing up the next generation together, men and women. And many of you, of course, did that. And many of you, if you didn't do it like me, you're watching your children do it, or hoping that your child, if she's a woman, is married to a man that she can do that with, and vice versa. Okay, we're going to move on to something called pregnancy discrimination. Go back one. Okay, thank you. Here, a law was struck down that made pregnant women ineligible for unemployment compensation because they didn't consider it a disability. The name of that case was Turner versus Department of Employment Security. Here, what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was really doing was she was really advocating for legislation. And, you know, I suppose some people have a negative connotation when someone says activist judge. Well, you know what? She was the best kind of activist judge in my mind. And pregnancy discrimination in the workplace was then included in sex discrimination laws. So I do have a funny little story. I was telling this to Stephen Cohen, who is in charge of the Meyerowitz Center programming, I believe. And Stephen and I spent, 16 hours on a bus, 8 hours each way, traveling to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to protest against the illegal interment of immigrant children. And that's how I got to be this presentation, because in 16 hours, you really get to know someone. And I found out that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, Marty, he was in ROTC, the reserves, and he got called up to active duty, he was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Well, like a lot of wives who were with their husbands at that time, she found a job. And she found a job with Social Security. And when she got pregnant, she got demoted. Now, is it any surprise that she would then be advocating for pregnancy discrimination to be included in sex discrimination laws? Let's move to employment discrimination, which was really one of her strong areas of emphasis, and probably an area that most of us are most familiar with. Ruth Bader Ginsburg saw people in the broadest range of their capacities. She did not see people as stereotype, so that women could have certain jobs and men could have certain jobs. I know when I graduated high school, you were supposed to be a teacher or a nurse. I was fortunate because my dad had 2 girls, so I was the boy, and he decided I should be a lawyer. But back in the 60s, there was a lot of stereotyping about what kinds of jobs women should hold. But that's different than when there is actually laws that discriminate against women in non-traditional jobs. Imagine now if there were laws that said women cannot be police officers. And there used to be laws that said that. Imagine if there were laws today that said women cannot work on naval ships. And there used to be laws like that. Or that secretaries should get lower wages than janitors, even though they were both performing very important tasks for businesses. So these are some of the other things that the Women's Rights Project championed for under the strong leadership and dedication of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and several other very important lawyers. Now let's take a look at some of the rulings, because there were many that you'll want to know about, and these I actually have dates on. Probably one of her earliest rulings, because she was appointed judge in 1993, was 1996. And this was United States versus Virginia. And that ruling struck down Virginia Military Institute's all-male admission policy making and made it clear that gender equality was a constitutional right. Now, if it had been a private college, there would have been a different ruling. But VMI was the last remaining all-male public undergraduate college or university at that time. And that is really just over 20 years ago. So that's really not that long ago. One of the things that I always found about Ruth Bader Ginsburg was that she was as proud of rulings that favored men in a gender equality case, or that came down harshly on men, as she was on statutes that came down in a discriminatory way to women. She was a true believer in gender equality. Let's take a look at another one of her famous quotes. I love this one. Generalization about the way women are. Estimates of what is appropriate for most women no longer, and I love when she says those strong words, no longer justifying opportunity to women whose talent and capacity place them outside the average description. So in lots of the Supreme Court arguments, they would be saying things like, well, women generally can't press 200 pounds, or they wouldn't be able to withstand the rigors of combat, or they don't have the same level of expertise in the STEM stuff. But what she's saying is, down with generalizations and up with women whose talent and capacity place them outside that average description. The other case, the next case, that most people, I think, really kind of rue, which she dissented on, is Bush v. Gore. That's just 20 years ago and probably makes us a little nervous about today. But that's where George Bush's campaign filed an emergency application to stop a Florida Supreme Court mandate for a manual recount. And guess what? The court ruled in favor of George W. Bush's campaign. And they did stop the counting of ballots in the Supreme Court. And that decision to end the recount effectively handed Bush the victory in Florida, as you know, one of the swing states, and in the election. Now, what's interesting on an individual basis for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, generally speaking, when a judge dissents, the judge says, I respectively dissent. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg wanted to make a statement. It wasn't an accident. In fact, nothing that Ruth Bader Ginsburg ever wrote was an accident. Every word was a pearl. And she just wrote, I dissent. She was bold, and we can take some kind of courage from the way she dealt with things. The next case is definitely one of my favorites. Obergefell versus Hodges. This is the landmark decision that granted same-sex couples the right to marry in all 50 states. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, marriage was a relationship between a dominant male to a subordinate female. Would it be a choice that states should still be allowed to have to cling to marriage the way it once was? And she derided a procreation debate by asking whether or not a 70-year-old heterosexual couple would be allowed to marry when clearly they could not procreate. She did not write the opinion in this case, but there is no question that her background and her relationships with the other judges allowed this decision to come down just 5 years ago. The next decision is usually called Shelby County. Next slide. It gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That was the right that gave protections to bar racial discrimination in voting. But the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional for Congress rather than the states to set rules for elections. RBG stated in that opinion, I love her writing, throwing out pre-clearance, what that meant was certain protections in place when it has worked and it is continuing to work to stop discrimination changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. I had to think about that one for a while. But, you know, the way that she writes and the way that she tries to persuade is truly as an educator. The next case is Sessions versus Demaio. This was a big win for Justice Ginsburg. It struck down legislation just 2 years ago that allowed certain non-citizens to be expelled from the country. And I think a lot of you remember that they were from certain countries that the generalization was that all of these people would be terrorists. It was legislatively vague and it violated the due process clause. And it is a strong precedent for going forward and demanding that legislation not be vague and that it not violate the due process clause. An older case is Olmstead versus LC. This is a landmark case concerning the rights of people with mental disabilities to live in their communities. It's actually also known as the integrative mandate. And so there were 2 women who had been medically cleared to move from an institution to a more community-based setting. And Georgia said no, they've got to stay in that institution. Well, the court found that it was a violation of Title II of the ADA, the American with Disability Act. And I think that is a very important decision for our community. Another favorite one that's known as Ledbetter is one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's famous dissents. You know, it's interesting. I think when I went to law school, we never talked as much about the dissents as being talked about now. Usually it was just talked about because if it was the ruling of the court, then that was really what was important. The dissents were just, you know, someone giving another opinion. That wasn't true with Justice Ginsburg. Her dissents were sort of like putting money in the bank and waiting to see what her investment would bring. Here, Lilly Ledbetter sued her employer of 19 years for gender discrimination. She was being paid less than males. She had worked there for 2 decades. There was a requirement under the law that she had to file her complaint 180 days of the violation. So that meant 100 days, 80 days of the violation, she wouldn't be able to get money for those 2 decades, just for 180 days. Well, that just was wrong to Justice Ginsburg. She felt that she needed to get the back pay for the entirety of her 2-decade tenure. And by the way, it was never an issue of whether there was discrimination. It was an issue of how much she should be paid. Okay, we're going to move to RBG's Descents. So as is true in many times, go back one, please. Lilly didn't know she was being discriminated against, so she couldn't have filed her complaint sooner. And RBG said, pay disparities often occur in small increments. Cause to suspect discrimination is at work develops over time. Comparative pay is often hidden from an employee's view. Yeah, you might be standing next to a guy and you're on an assembly line, and you know, unless he's a braggart, he's not going to tell you that he's making 25 an hour when you're making 17. So RBG translated the official dissent and all those legal terms into something we'll call the understandable version and read it publicly from the bench. I don't know anybody who's ever done that. Making sure something that she called and was the gender wage gap got its due attention. I would have loved to have been in that courtroom when she did that. And guess what? Her investment paid off, because in 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Act changed that law. She was what I would say more than a judge. Let's take a look at the next case, the Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt. And we just have really a few more cases, 2 more, and an ending, and then you'll have a chance for some questions. Just don't make them too hard, you know. Okay, the Supreme Court struck down Texas's restrictive abortion law that mandated that doctors performing procedures have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals and that clinics meet the same standards as outpatient surgical centers. And we know what that was all about. That was making it so that there wouldn't be a place that would be able to meet these kinds of standards and provide reproductive rights to women. RBG wrote a concurring opinion that made it clear that the court wouldn't take kindly to further attacks on abortion providers. And again, the concurring opinions and the dissents were her way of really stepping up. The last case we're going to talk about is Hawaii versus Trump. That's just 2 years ago. Here, the Supreme Court upheld President Donald Trump's executive order imposing a ban on Muslim immigration. And here's where RBG dissented. She called out the majority for ignoring the facts, misconstruing our legal precedent, and turning a blind eye to the pain and suffering the proclamation inflicts upon countless families and individuals, many who are U.S. citizens. I guess she had a really strong belief about that, which I share. So finally, I'm going to leave you with the part that I kind of started with when I said, may her memory be a blessing. And I'm calling this good advice. Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the pinnacle of professionalism and civility. She could disagree with her colleagues on the Supreme Court. She could appear with them at the opera and in the opera, but she knew that doing that was also a way of leading others to join her rather than to be brusque or harsh. So I think at this time, we could look down at the chat, see if we have anything. And if not, you could raise your hands and we'll figure out how to do that. I got to find the chat.
Well, Susan, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've heard a number of programs on Judge Ginsburg, and I thought yours is by far the best comprehensive some of the things that she accomplished. You should present this as a continuing legal education for the lawyers. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. So Jerry used to appear in front of me, and when he appeared in front of me and he would say that, I would think, oh, he's just currying favor with the court. But I'm not a judge anymore. So you didn't have to say that, Jerry. And I really appreciate your words. That's very kind. And I am quite willing to do that. And I did want to thank everybody at the Meyerowitz Center for their help in helping me be able to do this. And also everybody that showed up. I would just love to have like an hour with each of you.
It would be nice.
It would. And in person, wouldn't that even be better? I'm looking at the chat. And Nancy Price says something. Nancy was the one that came in for the save on the Reed case being 1971. Thanks, Nancy. You actually answered someone's question. That was Schuleman, right? Nancy says, RBG always was respectful of others, even when she disagreed. It was never personal. And you know what? That is a hard thing to do. I do have to say this one thing because I did forget to say it. It's another one of my favorite things that she said. So she would often be asked, how many women would be enough on the Supreme Court? And I think maybe the asker was thinking, maybe 4. How about 4? You know, didn't say anything. And she just boldly said 9. And then later, when asked to explain her answer, she said, well, you know, there were only 9 men were on the Supreme Court by themselves for a long period of time. Why are we so shocked that I would say 9? So I love that. That's I always thought about just wearing a shirt that said 9 on it. Anybody else have a question or just a shout out? Okay, this is from Harriet Snyder. Thanks, Harriet. How did RBG maintain a close friendship with Justice Scalia and still maintain her professional differences? Okay, so this may not exactly be the answer you're looking for, Harriet, but I think this is something that Justice Ginsburg shared about her marriage and also said it's also good advice in dealing with your colleagues. And what she said is, sometimes it's good to be a little deaf. And, you know, I've really thought about that and actually tried to do better in that regard too. And Unfortunately, I'm not impaired hearing wise, but I think sometimes it would be better if I were. Stephen Puro, how are you? I see his question on the chat. Stephen and I are longtime Democratic. She said, "Can I comment on RBG's relationship with Chief Justice Roberts?" I really can't. I don't have any information about that. I don't know that she had a bad relationship with anyone. That was what was exciting about her. But I do want to tell you something really exciting. I was Googling things about the National Association of Women Judges, because that's where I first met RBG in 1980. And I don't know why this is on the internet, but there was a list on the internet of all of the women judges who had gathered for a conference during the Jimmy Carter era. And he invited us to the White House for a reception. And it said list of all the attendees. So I scrolled through the list after I'm a B. I found my name and I'm like, that is where I met her. I met her at the White House, and she had just been appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and there weren't very many federal judges that were women at that time. So I really didn't get to talk to her very much because there was always a cluster of people around her congratulating her. But I'd just like to think that, hey, there we were at the White House together 40 years ago. I guess we might want to consider wrapping up. Judith, anything else?
Jacqueline Gerson has a question, I believe. Jacqueline?
Yes. My question is, what did you think of Bill McClellan's comment where he commented that when President Obama asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg to retire so he could appoint a liberal judge, and she would not do that? And now we're seeing that President Trump is going to have the opportunity of appointing another conservative Supreme Court judge.
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I guess my answer is probably shows my loyalty to the justice in saying that I wanted her on there for as long as I possibly could have her.
Yeah.
Who amongst us really ever thought we would really be in this position with this president at this time? I hope this doesn't take away your not-for-profit status, Stephen. But I just, and that is just true. So I'm glad she stayed. And I hear the opposite side of that. And yeah, I can understand why people with hindsight are like, oh my God, we had a chance. But I really do believe that I wanted to get as much out of her wisdom and her smart strategizing under the law to have her as long as we could. And for me, it was not long enough.
Sonia Davis put a question in the chat. Can you see it, Susan?
Let's see.
I can read it if you'd like.
Oh, yes.
Well, that was me, and I had the same question that Jackie did.
Same question. Yeah, right.
Hi, Sonny.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Sonny.
So you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say all of you, instead of her, you make her memory a blessing. You know how you can do it. You know what you need to do. And
some of us already have.
Yeah, good. I did too. I dropped it in the mail. Okay. Let's see. Was there one other one?
Shulamit says something.
When I raised the other question, I was trying to put the context in the Reed case with what I remember of the earliest days of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971, and how, as a newly married woman with my own credit card, I couldn't get them to put my name after I married on the credit card without my husband's permission.
Right. I think that Justice Ginsburg deserves a huge amount of credit for all the things that you see on your Facebook feed about being able to open up a bank account in your own name, to get a mortgage in your own name, to get a credit card in your own name. I mean, these are things we take for granted. They didn't exist then.
Right.
And, you know, I think that's why that case with the buying a beer is so funny to me, is that wherever there was gender equality, she was trying to level the playing field, make the point that it shouldn't exist. So nice to see you.
I want to thank you for doing this. I have to leave.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, this was really fun. I'll
It
see you
was.
all at Deerbergs or Bagels or someplace.
I'll say
Starbucks.
hi.
Or if you live in my neighborhood, stop by my sukkah and say hi.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Thank you so much, Susan. We
You're welcome.
appreciate
My
it.
honor. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.